The morning sun painted the Syrian desert in shades of gold and crimson as Eileen Kurd adjusted her rifle scope. She had been tracking the ISIS convoy for 3 days, moving like a shadow across the barren landscape that had become her hunting ground. The 24-year-old Kurdish sniper had earned a reputation that stretched far beyond the front lines, though she never sought fame or recognition. Eileen came from a small village near Kobani, where her father had taught her to shoot when she was barely 12 years old. He had been a Peshmerga fighter in his youth, and he understood that in their corner of the world, survival often depended on one's ability to defend their home and family. What he never expected was that his daughter would become one of the most feared fighters in the region. The convoy below consisted of 5 vehicles carrying ISIS militants toward a strategic position near the Turkish border. Eileen counted at least 20 fighters, all heavily armed and confident in their supposed divine protection. They had no idea they were being watched by someone they would soon learn to fear more than death itself. Through her scope, Eileen studied each vehicle carefully. She had learned to read the behavior of her enemies, understanding their patterns and weaknesses. ISIS fighters often traveled in predictable formations, relying on their reputation for brutality rather than tactical sophistication. This overconfidence had cost them dearly in recent months, particularly when they encountered Kurdish fighters who refused to be intimidated. The landscape around Eileen told the story of countless battles. Burned-out vehicles dotted the horizon, and the remnants of abandoned checkpoints served as grim reminders of the war that had consumed the region. Yet despite the devastation, life persisted. Desert flowers bloomed in scattered patches, and, occasionally, a bird would cross the sky, reminding everyone that the world continued beyond the violence. Eileen had joined the Kurdish Women's Protection Units, known as the YPJ, 2 years earlier after ISIS militants destroyed her village and killed her younger brother. The memory of that day still burned in her chest like a white-hot coal. She had watched from a hilltop as black smoke rose from her childhood home, knowing that everything she had known and loved was being erased by fanatics who believed their interpretation of religion justified any atrocity. The YPJ had given her purpose and a way to channel her grief into something meaningful. The organization was founded on principles of gender equality and democratic ideals that stood in stark contrast to ISIS's oppressive ideology. Women fought alongside men as equals, and many had proven themselves to be exceptional fighters who combined tactical skill with an unwavering commitment to protecting their communities. Training with the YPJ had transformed Eileen from a village girl who could shoot rabbits into a precision marksman capable of engaging targets at distances that seemed impossible. She learned to read wind patterns, calculate trajectory adjustments, and, most importantly, to remain calm under pressure. Her instructors noticed her natural ability quickly, but it was her psychological resilience that truly set her apart. The convoy began moving again, and Eileen shifted her position to maintain visual contact. She had been operating alone for weeks, which was unusual for YPJ fighters who typically worked in teams. However, Eileen had requested solo missions after proving her ability to operate independently without support. Her commanders trusted her judgment, understanding that her unique skills were best utilized when she had complete freedom of movement. Intelligence reports indicated that the convoy was carrying a high-value ISIS commander named Abu Rashid, a Syrian national who had orchestrated several brutal attacks against Kurdish civilians. Rashid was known for his strategic mind and his ability to inspire loyalty among younger fighters. Eliminating him would significantly disrupt ISIS operations in the region and potentially save dozens of innocent lives. As the vehicles approached a narrow pass between 2 rocky outcrops, Eileen recognized the perfect opportunity. The terrain would force the convoy to slow down and move in single file, making them vulnerable to a well-planned ambush. She began moving to a new position that would give her clear fields of fire while maintaining multiple escape routes. The desert wind carried the distant sound of engines and voices speaking Arabic. Eileen could hear the fighters laughing and joking, their confidence evident even from a distance. They believed they were untouchable, protected by their fearsome reputation and superior numbers. This arrogance would prove to be their downfall. Eileen reached her chosen position just as the lead vehicle entered the pass. Through her scope, she could see the driver's face clearly, along with the passenger who appeared to be studying a map. The second vehicle carried what appeared to be the commander, identifiable by his distinctive white head wrap, and the deference shown to him by other fighters. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate, and focusing entirely on the shot. Years of training had taught her to eliminate all distractions, to become one with her weapon and her target. The world narrowed to the crosshairs in her scope, and the slight pressure of her finger against the trigger. The first shot shattered the morning silence, striking the lead vehicle's driver with surgical precision. The vehicle veered off the narrow track and crashed into a boulder, blocking the path for the vehicles behind. Chaos erupted as ISIS fighters scrambled for cover, shouting orders and spraying automatic weapons fire in all directions. Eileen had already moved to her secondary position before the echo of her first shot faded. The militants were firing wildly, unable to identify her location or even determine the direction of the attack. She watched calmly as they exposed themselves in their panic, selecting her next targets with methodical precision. Her second shot eliminated a fighter who was attempting to establish a defensive position behind the crashed vehicle. The man dropped instantly, his weapon clattering across the rocky ground. The remaining militants began to understand they were dealing with a highly skilled sniper, but their training and discipline were insufficient for the situation they faced. Abu Rashid emerged from the second vehicle, rallying his men and attempting to organize a coordinated response. Eileen could see him clearly through her scope, noting the way other fighters looked to him for leadership. He was exactly the target she had been seeking, but she knew that eliminating him too quickly might allow the others to escape. Instead, she began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare. Her third shot shattered the windshield of the command vehicle, sending glass fragments flying but harming no one. The message was clear. She could have killed Rashid but chose not to, demonstrating complete control over the situation. The ISIS fighters began to panic more visibly. Some attempted to flee on foot, running across the open desert where they made easy targets. Others tried to use the vehicles as cover, not understanding that their positions were completely exposed to Eileen's elevated vantage point. She continued her methodical assault, each shot carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact while steadily reducing the enemy's numbers. The militants had entered the pass as confident predators. They were now trapped prey, helpless against an opponent they could neither see nor reach. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature began to rise dramatically. The ISIS fighters were dressed in heavy clothing and carrying significant equipment, making the desert heat an additional enemy. Several began showing signs of heat exhaustion, their movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. Eileen, dressed in lightweight desert camouflage and carrying only essential equipment, remained comfortable in her concealed position. She had learned to work with the desert rather than against it, understanding how to use the terrain and climate to her advantage. This knowledge, passed down through generations of Kurdish fighters, gave her a significant edge over foreign militants who had never adapted to the harsh environment. The battle continued for several hours, with Eileen maintaining complete control throughout. She moved between multiple prepared positions, never remaining in one location long enough for the enemy to triangulate her position. Each shot was precise and purposeful, designed to demoralize the survivors while eliminating specific threats. By midday, only 5 ISIS fighters remained alive, including Abu Rashid. They had barricaded themselves behind the vehicles, but their position was untenable. The desert sun had turned their metal cover into ovens, and their water supplies were running dangerously low. Eileen observed their growing desperation through her scope, noting how they had begun arguing among themselves. The stress of the prolonged engagement was breaking down their unit cohesion, turning former allies against each other. She had seen this pattern before. ISIS fighters were often brave when facing terrified civilians, but crumbled quickly when confronted by determined resistance. The afternoon brought new challenges as the wind began to pick up, creating dust clouds that reduced visibility. Eileen adjusted her tactics accordingly, using the changing conditions to move closer to her trapped opponents. She could hear them talking in increasingly panicked tones, their voices carrying clearly in the thin desert air. As the day progressed toward evening, The remaining ISIS fighters faced an impossible choice. They could remain in their defensive position and slowly succumb to heat exhaustion and thirst, or they could attempt to escape across open ground where Eileen could easily eliminate them. Either way, their situation was hopeless. The sun was beginning to set when Abu Rashid made an unexpected decision that would change everything. Standing up slowly with his hands partially raised, he called out in accented English, his voice echoing across the desert landscape. The words he spoke would soon become legend among Kurdish fighters and strike fear into the hearts of ISIS militants across the region. Abu Rashid's voice carried across the desert with a mixture of desperation and grudging respect. "Desert Ghost," he called out, using a name that had begun circulating among ISIS forces in recent weeks. "We know who you are. We surrender if you show yourself and walk away." Eileen remained perfectly still in her concealed position, processing this unexpected development. The name Desert Ghost had apparently been given to her by ISIS fighters who had survived previous encounters. She had heard whispers of it during intelligence briefings, but this was the first time an enemy had used it directly to address her. The irony was not lost on her. These same men who had terrorized countless innocent civilians were now begging for mercy from a single Kurdish woman. They had built their reputation on brutal intimidation and overwhelming force, yet here they stood, defeated by superior skill and unwavering determination. Through her scope, Eileen could see the remaining fighters clearly. Besides Rashid, four others remained alive, all showing signs of severe stress and exhaustion. Their confident demeanor from the morning had completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of men who knew they faced death. "We have heard the stories," Rashid continued, his voice growing stronger as desperation overcame his pride. "You are the woman who killed 15 fighters at Tal Afar, the one who held the crossroads at Sinjar for 3 days alone. Our brothers speak your name with fear." Eileen knew exactly which incidents he was referencing. The battle at Tal Afar had been her first major solo mission, where she had disrupted an entire ISIS advance by eliminating key commanders and machine gun positions. The siege at Sinjar had been even more challenging, as she had been cut off from friendly forces and forced to survive on her own while harassing enemy supply lines. The fact that ISIS fighters were discussing her actions among themselves was both valuable intelligence and a source of grim satisfaction. Fear was a weapon just as powerful as any rifle, and if her reputation could save Kurdish lives by making ISIS fighters hesitate or retreat, then she welcomed the notoriety. "Show yourself, Ghost," one of the other fighters called out, his voice cracking with stress. "We will throw down our weapons and leave this place. We want no more of your desert magic." Desert magic. The phrase would have been amusing under different circumstances. These fanatics who claimed divine support were now attributing supernatural powers to a 24-year-old woman with a rifle and superior training. Their fear had transformed her from human opponent into something mythical. Eileen considered her options carefully. The smart tactical decision would be to remain hidden and eliminate the remaining fighters. They were dangerous enemies who had committed terrible crimes and would likely continue to do so if allowed to escape. However, their surrender offer presented an interesting psychological opportunity. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and gunpowder across the battlefield. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from several directions, evidence of other engagements happening across the front lines. The war against ISIS was being fought by thousands of brave men and women, but, in this moment, this particular battle belonged entirely to her. Rashid began speaking again, this time in Arabic to his remaining men. Eileen's understanding of the language allowed her to follow their conversation. They were debating whether to attempt a coordinated escape or to continue trying to negotiate with their unseen opponent. The stress was clearly affecting their judgment and unit cohesion. "We know you understand Arabic, Ghost," Rashid said, switching back to English. "We have studied you. You are Eileen Kurd from Kobani. Your village is gone, but your legend grows. Even our most brave fighters speak of you with respect." The use of her real name sent a chill down Eileen's spine. ISIS intelligence networks were apparently more sophisticated than Kurdish forces had realized. The fact that they had identified her personally meant that her family members who had survived the village raid might now be in danger. This revelation changed everything. No longer was this simply a tactical engagement between opposing forces. It had become deeply personal. ISIS had not only destroyed her home and killed her brother, they had now made her a specific target. The organization's reach was longer than she had imagined. She thought about her surviving relatives who had fled to refugee camps in Turkey and Kurdistan. Her elderly aunt, her young cousins, her father's brother who had lost his leg in an old war. ISIS now knew exactly who she was and could potentially track down anyone connected to her family name. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the trapped fighters. Eileen could see them growing weaker by the hour, their heavy clothing and equipment becoming unbearable in the rising heat. Several were showing clear signs of dehydration, swaying slightly as they tried to maintain defensive positions. "Your silence speaks loudly, Ghost," Rashid called out again. "Perhaps you consider our offer? We are reasonable men. We did not choose this fight with you specifically. You have proven your point. We will spread word that this territory belongs to the Desert Ghost." The suggestion that they might actually fear her enough to abandon an area was intriguing. If ISIS fighters began avoiding regions where she operated, it could create safe corridors for civilian evacuation and Kurdish military operations. Her reputation might become a strategic asset beyond her individual combat effectiveness. Eileen decided to test their resolve. Moving carefully to avoid detection, she repositioned herself to get a clear shot at the water containers she could see near the vehicles. A well-placed bullet could eliminate their remaining hydration without killing anyone, forcing them to make a quicker decision about surrender or escape. Her shot rang out across the desert, striking a plastic water jug and sending its contents spraying across the sand. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The ISIS fighters understood that their opponent could have easily killed any of them but had chosen instead to eliminate their last hope of survival in the desert heat. "Wallahi, she toys with us like cats with mice," one of the fighters said in Arabic, his voice filled with terror. "This is not natural. No human shoots with such precision." Eileen almost smiled at the comment. Her exceptional marksmanship was the result of years of intensive training, natural talent, and countless hours of practice. There was nothing supernatural about it, but she was content to let her enemies believe otherwise if it served her purposes. The psychological warfare was working perfectly. The remaining fighters were now more afraid of her than they were of dying, which gave her unprecedented control over the situation. She could dictate terms, gather intelligence, or simply continue eliminating them one by one as she saw fit. Rashid seemed to understand the hopelessness of their situation better than his subordinates. He began giving orders in Arabic, apparently preparing his men for a desperate attempt to escape on foot. They were discussing different directions and trying to identify potential cover positions they might reach before being shot down. The conversation revealed valuable intelligence about ISIS operations in the region. Eileen listened carefully as they mentioned safe houses, communication procedures, and the locations of other units. This information could save many lives if she could find a way to relay it to Kurdish commanders. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the trapped fighters grew increasingly desperate. The desert heat was becoming unbearable, and their water supplies were now completely exhausted. Several were showing signs of serious heat exhaustion, slumping against the vehicles and breathing heavily. "Ghost," Rashid called out once more, his voice now hoarse with thirst and exhaustion. "We accept that you have defeated us. We ask only for the chance to die with honor rather than like animals in this desert. If you will not accept our surrender, then end this quickly." The request for honorable death rather than slow suffering in the desert heat showed a side of the ISIS commander that Eileen had not expected. Despite his crimes and brutal ideology, he was trying to maintain some form of dignity in defeat. It was a very human moment in the midst of a dehumanizing conflict. Eileen found herself facing a moral dilemma she had not anticipated. These men were undoubtedly war criminals who deserved no mercy for their actions against innocent civilians. However, allowing them to die slowly of thirst and heat exhaustion felt unnecessarily cruel, even for enemies who had shown no mercy to others. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in brilliant shades of orange and red. Soon, The crushing heat would give way to the bone-chilling cold of a desert night. The ISIS fighters would face new challenges as the temperature dropped, and they struggled to survive without proper shelter or equipment. Eileen made her decision. Rising from her concealed position for the first time since the engagement began, she appeared on a rocky outcrop about 300 meters from the trapped vehicles. At this distance, she remained well beyond the effective range of their assault rifles while clearly demonstrating her presence and capability. The sight of the legendary desert ghost finally, revealing herself, sent shockwaves through the surviving ISIS fighters. They had been battling an invisible enemy all day, and now they could see the person who had single-handedly destroyed their unit. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Standing silhouetted against the setting sun, Eileen cut an imposing figure despite her relatively small stature. Her desert camouflage, advanced optics, and precision rifle marked her as a professional soldier far removed from the crude stereotype of female fighters that ISIS propaganda had promoted. She was clearly a formidable opponent who had earned her fearsome reputation through skill and determination. For several long moments, neither side moved or spoke. The desert evening was filled only with the whisper of wind across sand and stone. Then, Eileen's voice carried clearly across the distance, speaking in accented but perfect Arabic that every fighter below could understand perfectly. "I am Eileen Kurd." Her voice echoed across the desert floor, calm and steady despite the day's intense battle. "You know my name, and now you see my face. You speak of surrender, but surrender is not yours to offer." The ISIS fighters below stood transfixed, staring up at the figure who had become their nightmare. Abu Rashid stepped forward slightly, shading his eyes against the setting sun as he tried to get a better look at the woman who had destroyed his convoy and killed his men with surgical precision. "You destroyed my village," Eileen continued, her voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. "You murdered my brother. You speak of honor, but where was honor when you burned homes with families inside? Where was honor when you enslaved women and children?" The weight of her words settled over the battlefield like a physical presence. These men had participated in countless atrocities, believing themselves righteous warriors fighting for a divine cause. Now they faced the sister of one of their victims, and her presence transformed their abstract crimes into very personal consequences. Rashid found his voice, calling back across the distance. "We are soldiers, as you are a soldier. We followed orders, as you follow orders." The village was a military target because it harbored Kurdish fighters. "My brother was 8 years old," Eileen replied, her voice never losing its controlled calm. "Was he a military target? Were the grandmothers who died in their beds military targets? You are not soldiers. You are murderers who hide behind religion to justify cruelty." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that would never be extinguished. The surviving ISIS fighters shifted uncomfortably, perhaps for the first time confronting the human cost of their actions through the eyes of someone who had lost everything to their cause. "What do you want from us, Ghost?" one of the younger fighters called out, his voice breaking with stress and dehydration. "We cannot bring back your brother. We cannot rebuild your village. We can only die here in this place." Eileen studied the men below through her rifle scope, noting their individual faces and expressions. Each represented dozens of crimes against innocent people, yet seeing them as desperate human beings struggling to survive created an unexpected complexity to her emotions. "You will die here," she confirmed, her voice carrying no satisfaction or anger, only certainty. "But first, you will tell me about the other units operating in this region. You will give me intelligence that can save the lives your organization plans to take." The proposition was clever from multiple perspectives. Any information they provided could help Kurdish forces protect civilian populations and plan more effective operations. Additionally, forcing ISIS fighters to betray their own organization would create psychological damage that extended beyond this specific engagement. Rashid laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the rocky walls of the pass. "You think we will betray our brothers to save ourselves a few more hours of suffering? You understand nothing about our dedication to the cause. I understand that your dedication ended when you offered to surrender in exchange for my departure," Eileen replied smoothly. You proved your true commitment when you chose to save yourselves rather than fight to the death as your ideology demands. The observation struck home with devastating accuracy. By offering to surrender, the ISIS fighters had already violated their own stated beliefs about martyrdom and divine duty. They had chosen survival over ideology, which undermined any claims to religious motivation for their actions. The men below began arguing among themselves in rapid Arabic, their voices rising as stress and hopelessness took their toll. Some wanted to attempt an escape, others advocated for a suicidal charge against Eileen's position, and still others supported providing the information she demanded in hopes of buying more time. Eileen listened carefully to their debate, gathering additional intelligence about their unit structure and operational procedures. Even their arguments revealed valuable information about ISIS command relationships and decision-making processes that could be useful to Kurdish intelligence officers. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, the temperature began dropping noticeably. The desert's extreme daily temperature swings would soon become a new threat to the stranded fighters, who lacked proper equipment for surviving a cold night in the open. "The ghost asks for information," Rashid finally called out, having apparently won the argument among his surviving men. "What assurance do we have that providing this information will change our fate? Why should we help you kill more of our brothers?" "You have no assurance," Eileen replied honestly. "Your fate was sealed when you chose to murder innocents rather than fight honorable enemies. I offer you nothing except the chance to reduce the suffering your organization will inflict on others." The brutal honesty of her response seemed to surprise the ISIS fighters, who had perhaps expected some form of negotiation or false promises. Eileen's directness eliminated any illusion that cooperation would save their lives while still presenting them with a moral choice about their final actions. "You are cruel, woman," one of the fighters said, his voice filled with despair. "You offer us nothing but demand everything. This is not the behavior of an honorable warrior." "Honor," Eileen repeated the word thoughtfully. "You speak often of honor for men who have none. I will tell you about honor. Honor is protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Honor is standing against evil even when you stand alone. Honor is remembering the innocent dead and ensuring their deaths have meaning." Her words carried the weight of personal experience and genuine conviction. Unlike the hollow rhetoric of ISIS propaganda, Eileen's understanding of honor came from real sacrifice and moral courage. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The desert evening brought new sounds as the temperature dropped and the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, the call of a desert fox echoed across the landscape, a reminder that life continued even in this harsh environment. Stars began appearing in the clear sky, brilliant points of light that had witnessed countless human conflicts across the centuries. "Very well, Ghost," Rashid said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "We will share what we know. But understand that this information comes not from fear or hope of mercy, but from recognition that you are a worthy enemy who has earned the right to our final intelligence." The acknowledgement represented a significant psychological victory. These ISIS fighters, who had been indoctrinated to believe that women were inferior beings worthy only of subjugation, were now openly admitting that a female Kurdish fighter had proven herself superior to their entire unit. Over the next hour, Eileen extracted detailed information about ISIS operations across a wide area of the Syrian-Iraqi border region. The intelligence included troop movements, supply routes, planned attacks against civilian targets, and the locations of command centers that Kurdish forces had been trying to locate for months. Each piece of information was carefully verified through cross-questioning and comparison with previously known intelligence. Eileen's interrogation techniques were professional and effective, demonstrating training that went far beyond basic military skills. She had clearly studied advanced intelligence gathering methods. The ISIS fighters provided information about an upcoming attack against a Kurdish refugee camp that housed over 3,000 displaced civilians. The planned assault was scheduled for the following week and would involve coordinated strikes by multiple ISIS units converging from different directions. This intelligence alone justified the entire engagement. Thousands of innocent lives could now be saved through advance warning and proper defensive preparations. The information also revealed the locations of ISIS staging areas that could be targeted by Kurdish forces before the attack commenced. As the night grew colder, the surviving fighters huddled together near the vehicles, sharing body warmth and trying to conserve energy. Their earlier confidence and bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the grim recognition that they would not survive to see another sunrise. "Is there anything else, Ghost?" Rashid asked, his voice now barely audible across the distance. "We have told you everything we know. Our intelligence is complete, and our consciences are clear before Allah." Eileen considered the situation carefully. The intelligence-gathering phase was complete, but she faced a final decision about how to conclude the engagement. The ISIS fighters had provided valuable information that would save many lives, but they remained dangerous enemies who could not be allowed to escape. "There is one more thing," she called back across the darkening desert. "I want you to record a message for your surviving brothers. Tell them exactly what happened here today. Tell them about the desert ghost and what awaits those who make war against innocent people." The request was strategically brilliant. A recorded testimony from respected ISIS fighters about their defeat would spread fear throughout the organization while potentially deterring future attacks against Kurdish communities. The psychological warfare value of such a recording could equal the impact of several military victories. Using a cell phone they had been carrying for communication purposes, the survivors recorded detailed statements about their encounter with the legendary desert ghost. They described her tactical skills, her psychological dominance of the engagement, and their complete inability to counter her methods. Most importantly, they confirmed that the stories circulating about her previous exploits were true and warned other ISIS units that engaging Kurdish forces in areas where she operated was tantamount to suicide. The recording would become a powerful propaganda tool that enhanced Eileen's growing reputation across the region. As the desert night reached its coldest point, Eileen made her final preparations. The intelligence had been gathered, the psychological objectives achieved, and the tactical situation resolved. Only one task remained, and it was perhaps the most difficult of all. The desert night had reached its deepest point when Eileen made her final decision. The stars overhead bore silent witness to countless conflicts throughout history, but few could match the psychological complexity of this particular engagement. She had achieved every tactical and intelligence objective, yet the human element remained unresolved. The ISIS fighters below had stopped talking among themselves, conserving their remaining energy as the desert cold sapped their strength. They sat huddled together near the vehicles, no longer resembling the confident militants who had entered the pass that morning. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Eileen understood that her next actions would define not only the conclusion of this battle but also her own evolution as both a fighter and a human being. The choice between mercy and justice, between strategic necessity and personal vengeance, would reveal the true nature of her character. Through her rifle scope, she could see Abu Rashid clearly despite the darkness. The ISIS commander sat apart from his remaining men, staring up at the stars with an expression of resigned acceptance. He had faced the reality of his situation with more dignity than she had expected from someone whose organization was built on brutality and intimidation. "Rashid," she called out across the distance, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "You speak of Allah and divine purpose. Do you truly believe your God approves of murdering children and enslaving women?" The question struck at the heart of the ideological contradiction that drove many ISIS fighters. They claimed religious motivation for actions that violated the fundamental principles of mercy and justice found in Islamic teaching. Confronting this hypocrisy might plant seeds of doubt that could survive even if the men did not. "I have done what I believed was righteous," Rashid replied, his voice thoughtful and subdued. "If I was wrong, then Allah will judge me accordingly. But I cannot change the past, only accept responsibility for my choices." The admission was remarkable coming from an ISIS commander, who were typically trained to justify their actions through elaborate theological arguments. Rashid's acknowledgement of potential error suggested either genuine self-reflection or the psychological impact of facing imminent death. "Your organization has declared war against the Kurdish people," Eileen continued. "Not against soldiers, but against our entire culture and way of life. You seek to erase us from the earth as you have tried to erase the Yazidis, the Christians, and others who refuse to submit to your vision. Yes, Rashid confirmed simply. We believe that was necessary for the establishment of the true Islamic State. We believe that compromise with unbelievers was impossible and that only total victory would bring peace. The honest acknowledgement of genocidal intent removed any remaining ambiguity about the nature of the conflict. This was not a conventional war between opposing armies, but an existential struggle between those who valued diversity and coexistence and those who demanded absolute conformity through violence. Eileen thought about the Kurdish communities that had welcomed refugees from across the region, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. Yazidi families, Christian minorities, and even Arab civilians fleeing ISIS control had found safety and acceptance in Kurdish territories. The contrast with ISIS ideology could not have been more stark. Yet here you sit, defeated by a woman from the very people you sought to destroy, she observed. What does this tell you about the strength of your cause and the weakness of your methods? The psychological impact of being defeated by someone ISIS ideology considered inherently inferior was devastating to their worldview. If their beliefs about gender, religion, and divine support were correct, such a defeat should have been impossible. The cognitive dissonance was undeniable. It tells me, Rashid said after a long pause, that we may have misunderstood the nature of the test we faced. Perhaps our defeat was ordained to teach us humility before the end. The philosophical response revealed a more sophisticated mind than Eileen had expected. Despite his crimes, Rashid was clearly an intelligent man capable of complex reasoning. This made his choices even more troubling, as they represented conscious evil rather than mere ignorance. The temperature continued dropping as the night progressed, and Eileen could see the ISIS fighters beginning to suffer from the cold. Their heavy clothing, which had been a liability during the day's heat, was insufficient protection against the bone-chilling desert night. Hypothermia would soon become a significant threat. Ghost, one of the younger fighters called out, his teeth chattering audibly. We have given you what you asked. We have recorded our testimony. If you mean to kill us, please do so quickly. This cold is worse than bullets. The plea for a quick death rather than slow suffering from exposure represented the complete breakdown of their will to resist. These men who had terrorized entire communities were now reduced to begging for mercy from their intended victim. Eileen considered the tactical situation one final time. The intelligence she had gathered could save thousands of lives and significantly disrupt ISIS operations throughout the region. The psychological impact of the defeat would spread far beyond these specific fighters, potentially deterring future attacks against Kurdish targets. However, the strategic value of her actions extended beyond immediate military gains. The story of this engagement would become legend among Kurdish forces, inspiring fighters throughout the region. More importantly, it would demonstrate to ISIS that their reign of terror could be challenged successfully by those they had tried to subjugate. I want you to understand something before this ends, Eileen said, her voice carrying a finality that made the ISIS fighters look up from their huddle. Your brother who killed my family thought he was serving God. You thought you were building paradise through murder and slavery. But you were only feeding your own hatred and fear. The words carried the weight of personal experience and moral authority that no propaganda could match. Eileen had faced the worst that ISIS could offer and emerged stronger rather than consumed by revenge. Her response to tragedy had been to protect others rather than seek indiscriminate vengeance. The Kurdish people will survive your attempts at genocide, she continued. Our children will grow up free, our women will fight as equals beside our men, and our communities will welcome those who seek refuge from hatred. Everything you tried to destroy will flourish. The declaration was both a promise and a prophecy. Despite suffering tremendous losses, Kurdish communities had indeed proven their resilience and commitment to the values ISIS sought to eliminate. The contrast between their approaches to conflict revealed fundamental differences in character and purpose. Rashid stood up slowly, his movements stiff from cold and exhaustion. You have won more than a battle today, Ghost. You have proven that your way is stronger than ours. I do not ask for forgiveness, because I do not deserve it. I ask only that you remember we were men who lost their way rather than monsters who never had souls. The request for human recognition rather than demonization was surprisingly profound. Even ISIS fighters, despite their terrible crimes, remained human beings capable of regret and self-awareness. Acknowledging their humanity while condemning their actions required a moral complexity that pure hatred could never achieve. I will remember, Eileen promised. And I will ensure others remember as well. Your names will be known, your crimes documented, and your defeat recorded. But you will be remembered as men who chose evil, not as evil incarnate. The distinction was important for psychological and historical reasons. Treating enemies as inhuman monsters made it easier to justify atrocities in response, potentially creating cycles of escalating violence. Recognizing their humanity while holding them accountable for their choices maintained moral boundaries even in warfare. The final moments of the engagement arrived with the first hint of dawn on the eastern horizon. The desert stars began fading as the sky gradually lightened, bringing the promise of another scorching day. The cycle of extreme heat and cold would continue regardless of human conflicts. Eileen raised her rifle for the last time, the scope crosshairs steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. The shot had to be clean and quick, ending the suffering without prolonging the inevitable. Professional competence remained important even in these final seconds. La ilaha illa Allah, Rashid said quietly, speaking the Islamic declaration of faith as he faced east toward Mecca. His surviving men joined him in the prayer, their voices carrying clearly across the silent desert landscape. The prayer completed, Rashid looked directly toward Eileen's position despite the distance and darkness. We are ready, Desert Ghost. End this with honor. Eileen's finger tightened on the trigger as she made her final calculation. The shot had to be perfect, demonstrating respect for the gravity of the moment while fulfilling the tactical necessity of eliminating dangerous enemies. Everything came down to this single moment of decision. The first rays of dawn painted the desert in soft shades of pink and gold as Eileen lowered her rifle without firing. The decision came not from mercy or weakness, but from a deeper understanding of victory that transcended simple elimination of enemies. She had already won everything that mattered in this engagement. The ISIS fighters below waited in tense silence, expecting bullets that would never come. Instead, they heard Eileen's voice carrying clearly across the distance one final time, speaking words that would haunt ISIS fighters across the region for years to come. You offered to surrender if I walked away, she called out, her voice steady and clear. I reject your surrender, but I will walk away. Not because you asked, but because I choose to. You are already dead men, destroyed by your own choices and failures. The desert will finish what your cowardice started. The psychological impact was devastating. By refusing to kill them directly, Eileen demonstrated complete dominance over the situation while denying them even the dignity of death in battle. They would face the desert's heat and cold, thirst and exposure, with the knowledge that their legendary opponent had found them unworthy of her bullets. Abu Rashid staggered to his feet, understanding the implications immediately. Ghost, he called out desperately. You cannot leave us here to die slowly. We are soldiers. We deserve better than this. Soldiers deserve honor, Eileen replied, already beginning to move away from her position. You are murderers who prey on the innocent. You deserve exactly what you gave to my 8-year-old brother and countless other children. The comparison was precise and devastating. The ISIS fighters had shown no mercy to helpless civilians, torturing and killing without regard for age or innocence. Now they faced the same hopeless terror they had inflicted on others, understanding too late the true meaning of their actions. As Eileen moved across the desert landscape with practiced stealth, she could hear the fighters below beginning to panic. Their disciplined acceptance of death evaporated when faced with slow dying rather than quick execution. The psychological torture was more effective than any physical punishment could have been. The intelligence she had gathered during the night was already being transmitted to Kurdish commanders through encrypted communication channels. Within hours, defensive preparations would begin around the threatened refugee camp, and counterstrikes would be launched against the ISIS staging areas she had identified. The recorded testimonies from the defeated fighters would be broadcast throughout the region, spreading fear and doubt among ISIS ranks while boosting morale among Kurdish forces. The psychological warfare value of the Desert Ghost legend would continue growing, making her as valuable as an entire military unit. Behind her, the sounds of desperation and argument grew fainter as distance increased. The ISIS fighters were discovering the terrible reality of the situation they faced. Without water, shelter, or hope of rescue, the desert would become their executioner while Eileen remained untainted by direct revenge. The moral complexity of her decision would be debated among Kurdish commanders and philosophers for years to come. Some would argue that swift execution would have been more merciful, while others would praise her restraint in avoiding unnecessary killing. The truth lay somewhere between mercy and justice. As the sun climbed higher, Eileen reached a predetermined extraction point where a Kurdish patrol waited to provide transportation back to friendly territory. The soldiers greeted her with expressions of respect and awe, having heard radio reports about the engagement throughout the night. "Is it true, Eileen?" the patrol leader asked quietly. "Did you really defeat an entire ISIS convoy alone and force their surrender?" "They defeated themselves," she replied simply, accepting water and basic medical attention. "I merely helped them understand the consequences of their choices." The deflection was typical of her approach to the growing legends surrounding her exploits. Eileen never sought personal glory or recognition, focusing instead on tactical results and strategic objectives. Her humility in the face of extraordinary achievements only enhanced her reputation among Kurdish fighters. During the journey back to base, radio reports continued arriving about ISIS movements across the region. The intelligence gathered during the night was already producing results as Kurdish forces intercepted enemy communications and prepared defensive positions based on the new information. Most significantly, the planned attack against the refugee camp was being disrupted as Kurdish special forces struck the ISIS staging areas with precision raids. Thousands of innocent civilians would remain safe because of the information extracted from 5 desperate fighters in a desert pass. The strategic impact extended far beyond immediate tactical gains. Within days, stories about the Desert Ghost's latest victory spread throughout ISIS ranks, creating paranoia and hesitation among fighters who had previously been confident in their superiority. Some units began refusing missions in areas where she might be operating. Kurdish communities throughout the region took inspiration from the stories, understanding that even their most ruthless enemies could be defeated by courage, skill, and unwavering determination. Young women began joining the YPJ in record numbers, many specifically citing Eileen's example as their motivation. The psychological warfare campaign that began with a single sniper in the desert created ripple effects throughout the broader conflict. ISIS commanders found themselves fighting not only Kurdish military forces, but also the growing legend of an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move and counter their every strategy. International media eventually picked up the story, though many details were classified to protect operational security. The image of a young Kurdish woman single-handedly defeating hardened terrorists captured global imagination and provided a powerful counter-narrative to ISIS propaganda about female subjugation. Eileen herself remained focused on immediate tactical objectives rather than long-term historical significance. She continued operating throughout the region, disrupting enemy activities and gathering intelligence while the legend of the Desert Ghost grew beyond her personal involvement in creating it. Years later, when ISIS had been militarily defeated and their territory liberated, historians would mark the engagement at the Desert Pass as a turning point in the psychological dimension of the conflict. The moment when Kurdish resistance transformed from defensive survival to offensive confidence. The 5 ISIS fighters who died slowly in the desert became symbols of their organization's ultimate weakness. Despite their technological advantages, numerical superiority, and international support networks, they proved incapable of defeating the human spirit embodied by a single determined woman with a rifle and unshakable moral purpose. The refugee camp that would have been attacked remained safe throughout the war, eventually growing into a permanent settlement where former ISIS victims built new lives in freedom. Children who survived because of intelligence gathered in a desert pass grew up to become doctors, teachers, and leaders who would shape the region's future. Abu Rashid's final radio transmission, broadcasting the location of the disabled convoy, was intercepted by Kurdish intelligence but never answered by ISIS forces. The organization had already begun distancing itself from units that encountered the Desert Ghost, unwilling to risk additional defeats that might damage their carefully crafted image of invincibility. The weapons and equipment recovered from the convoy were redistributed to Kurdish fighters, while the vehicles were repaired and pressed into service for humanitarian missions. The transformation of ISIS tools of oppression into instruments of liberation provided symbolic closure to the engagement. Eileen continued serving with distinction until the end of the conflict, participating in dozens of operations that saved countless lives and hastened the collapse of ISIS territorial control. However, she never forgot the lesson learned in the Desert Pass about the power of psychological warfare and the importance of moral authority in achieving lasting victory. The name Desert Ghost became permanently associated with Kurdish resistance to extremism and oppression. Long after Eileen herself retired from active combat, new generations of fighters adopted the title, ensuring that the legend would outlive any individual and continue inspiring those who fought for freedom against impossible odds. The empty Desert Pass, marked only by the rusting remains of destroyed vehicles and scattered equipment, became an unofficial memorial to the power of individual courage in the face of organized evil. Travelers occasionally reported hearing voices on the wind, though whether these were echoes of the past or promises for the future remained a matter of personal interpretation. In the end, the Desert Ghost's greatest victory was not the elimination of enemies, but the demonstration that even the most ruthless oppressors could be defeated by ordinary people willing to sacrifice everything for the protection of innocence. The legend lived on because it represented hope that no darkness was permanent and no evil was truly invincible.